any interest, financial or otherwise, as we move through today's business. We have no matters arising or any issues that I want to raise at this point, so we'll save that until tomorrow. So our one item of business are the report of the independent review of home to school transport. Just refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 7. We also have a copy of the home to school transport review report, a copy of PEDU stage 2 report on home to school transport and other relevant correspondence. And I'd just like to welcome our witness, with Shan Thornthwaite, who is the chairperson of the panel. You're very welcome this afternoon.
Thank you very much,
and
Chair.
You're very brave to come alone.
Oh, look, we got.
Thank you for your time this afternoon, and if you'd like to make an opening statement, and members will then follow up with some questions.
I have prepared a short opening statement, yes. Firstly, I'd very much like to thank the committee this afternoon for the invitation to meet with you. And as you've mentioned, I am here on my own, but I do acknowledge the contribution from my other two panel members. And we very much welcome the opportunity to present the main findings and recommendation from the report, and also the opportunity to answer questions. Before I do begin, I would just point out that it has now been nearly 12 months since we took the evidence for this report, and quite a period of time since I wrote it. So if I am not able to answer anything today, or I need to go back for anything, I'm more than happy to respond to and expand on responses if needs be. The report obviously has been prepared in response to the terms of reference that I'm sure the committee are familiar with. These were extremely broad in their scope, hence the complexity of the report and the breadth of the recommendations as well. The recommendations encompass both suggestions for improving policies and practices and processes, as well as more fundamental policy change that we recognise would necessitate legislation. The main purpose of the review was to ensure that home to school transport policy is fit for purpose, sufficiently targets pupils' needs, and is consistent with and supports departmental policy objectives. It was therefore not only looking at whether today's home to school policy was fit for purpose, but also very much looking towards the future, taking into account trends in school population, area planning, the sort of evolving education policies, and the programme for government aspirations. So it was very much looking forward. Specifically, the panel was asked to look at, firstly, the extent of entitlement to home-to-school transport and the balance of responsibility between parent and state, not only in terms of who should receive transport, either free or subsidised, but also for what journeys. So whether it should just be restricted to journeys for beginning and end of the school day, but also during the school day or for after-school purposes as well. The second element was to look at how any transport should be provided. We were also asked to take specific account of the existing legal duties to encourage and facilitate the development of both integrated and Irish medium education. Those pupils who have additional needs or barriers to learning. The other factors that we were asked to take into account included cross-border school attendance and sustainability, both financially and environmentally, and also to look at issues around safety and quality. We have met with extensive range of individuals. I think in total we took evidence from more than 160 individuals representing about 80 organisations, and that ranged from school principals, members of the travelling community. We met with parents' organisations, young people's advocacy groups, as well as transport providers. We had a number of briefings from all the relevant departments, including education, employment and learning, environment and regional development. We also visited a number of other jurisdictions to see how home-to-school transport compared with other areas of the UK, but also Ireland as well, and looking at both urban and rural. And in doing that, we met with both Transport for London, with the Department for Education in London, the Welsh Government, and local authorities as well. We put out a formal call for evidence, which I suspect many of you saw. That generated more than 1,000 responses. And we also visited schools in every one of the education and library boards, including primary, post-primary, special schools, and alternative education provision as well. And I think most importantly, we met with more than 200 young people. And deliberately, we included those who received free school transport and those who didn't receive free school transport, and included both those in sort of rural and urban, each of the local education and library boards, and right across the different categories of school as well. And I think the panel were extremely impressed at the thoughtful responses we got from young people when we did this review. Just to sort of give an overview of the current system of school transport, in Northern Ireland it dates back to sort of the 1940s, and the current policy framework is largely unchanged to date. Despite education provision, traffic conditions and expectations all changing substantially in the last 70 years. Today, as then, free school transport is based on whether or not children travel to their nearest suitable school and whether they live more than walking distance from school. I think the point to make, that I would like to make at the moment, is that only a minority of children currently qualify for free home-to-school transport. About 30% in Northern Ireland get free travel. Majority, about 70% and nearly 90% of primary school pupils actually make their own way to and from school, either paying their own bus fares or travelling in parental car or on foot. The current provision costs the Department for Education about £75 million a year, although it was clear when we looked at the other areas of spending that the total on all home-to-school travel is nearer to £100 million a year, when you include expenditure by Department for Education and Learning and the other sort of areas of spend that are going in as well. Although Northern Ireland is very similar in many ways to other countries within the UK and in Ireland, there are some real notable differences that make the system of home-to-school transport in Northern Ireland stand out. In comparison to elsewhere, there are a very large proportion of children who do qualify. Wales is very similar in terms of rurality. There, about 11% of the school population qualify for free transport. Here, it's nearer to a third. And the reason for that is largely due to the fact that free transport is offered to any school within certain categories beyond walking distance. That provides transport to a wide range of schools for some pupils, but not for others. So, for example, if your child lives more than 3 miles from the nearest non-denominational grammar school, then transport will be offered free of charge to any non-denominational grammar school beyond that walking distance threshold. What this means is that some pupils in Northern Ireland are travelling exceptionally long distances, and overall school journeys to post-primary schools here are 6 miles in length, compared to about 3.5 miles elsewhere in the UK. That's adding about 144 million extra miles of travel. Our evidence suggested that whilst choice of school was important for young people, the current school transport system was perceived as inequitable, as it supports the exercise of some choice but not others. For example, school transport won't be provided to choose if they're choosing a school on the basis of particular subject or because of single-sex education. In addition, the other thing that came out clearly from our evidence was that the categories of school being used to determine eligibility are increasingly out of date, as we're seeing the emergence of more shared education, blurring the lines between types of school, and new categories emerge, for example, non-selective grammar schools. The costs of transport here compare well to elsewhere. Because the proportion of pupils who qualify for free transport accounts for a larger proportion of the overall education budget than it does elsewhere in the UK. I mean, here you're spending about 4% of your education budget on home-to-school transport. Similar countries are spending about 2%. It is accounting for a substantially larger proportion of your education budget. And the complexity of journey to support choice of school adds the equivalent to about £30 million per year. How school transport is provided for children in Northern Ireland also is quite distinct from elsewhere in the United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland, you've got a large fleet of dedicated school buses, and you've also got exceptionally high use of public transport. And costs of transport on each of the two fleets are very similar, but pupils' perceptions of the two services are very, very different. Pupils who qualify for free transport and receive a ticket to travel on TransLink often benefit from being able to stay for after-school activities at no additional cost. This particularly benefits those who are attending the grammar schools. 60% of the children travelling to grammar schools qualify for free transport, but 90% of those receive a sessional ticket. Whereas those who are travelling on board buses often only have a journey immediately before or after school. Consultation with children consistently emphasised the role and the need for free transport in enabling after-school activities and participation in those. That came out very, very strongly in all of the groups that we did and in responses to our evidence. The other notable difference in Northern Ireland is how those who aren't eligible for free transport travel to school. About a quarter of your primary school pupils and less than 20% of your post-primary school pupils walk to school. Car use for the school journey is exceptionally high in Northern Ireland. About 60% of primary school age pupils are travelling by car, compared to nearer 40% in Great Britain. Given the impact that peak hour school journeys have on traffic and the growing evidence of rising childhood obesity, these markedly different patterns of school journey, I would have thought, are of considerable concern. I'd also say that the trends are also in the wrong direction. Walking is actually declining for the journey to and from school in Northern Ireland. For this reason, the report has made a number of recommendations relating to improvements in safety, encouraging walking and cycling, particularly for short journeys, and encouraging a much more coherent, sustainable travel approach. Overall, the review concluded that this current system of home-to-school transport is unsustainable, not only environmentally but also financially going forward. It no longer reflects the evolving education provision or aspirations by and for young people in Northern Ireland, where education provision today is not only delivered in classes during the traditional school day at one fixed location, but increasingly it requires pupils to move between sites to benefit from the full entitlement framework and to be able to participate in a wide range of curricular and extracurricular activities. The report therefore concluded that there should be a redirection of transport resources, focusing the provision of transport to the nearest school only, thereby allowing monies to support a more equitable offer of transport services for after-school activities for all pupils. It would also enable the walking distance to be reduced from 3 miles to 2, a distance considered by many who gave us evidence as being more acceptable to walk or cycle. The review also highlighted clearly the importance of appropriate, targeted and consistent transport provision for those young people who have additional barriers to learning. For example, those who have special needs, who are looked after by the local authority, or who are school-age mothers. For Northern Ireland's most vulnerable young people and those most at risk of being excluded, the provision of timely, consistent and high-quality school transport clearly helps ensure attendance and continued participation. Finally, the review demonstrated the often wide divergence between professionals' perceptions of what is provided for young people and what they expect or experience on a day-to-day basis. And there is clearly a need to enable young people's voices to be heard and for them to be able to engage in, share and contribute to this area of public policy.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose I have to say that I do welcome many of the recommendations, in particular around road safety and also looking at the flexibility around the sessional ticket and how that can be used, particularly for entitlement framework and work with the movement for within the ALCs. A number of the recommendations obviously focus around administration and particularly around the education library boards, and with the move now towards the Education Authority, you would assume that quite a number of those will actually sort of evolve naturally and be resolved in the not so distant future as it takes up its role then in April. I'm also mindful of the fact that really we're still waiting for the outcome of the Minister's views on the review, and obviously any changes will be subject to consultation, particularly if there's going to be a change in policy or any legislative change. There have been very early concerns mooted in relation to your choice of option 3 and looking at only providing transport to nearest school, and obviously the fact that we're in a very unique situation in Northern Ireland with the number of sectors that obviously does cause a problem, be it for selective, non-selective, and then between maintained, controlled and Irish medium and English, as you're well versed now, I suppose, in the complexities of that. There is a certain assumption probably in what you've in opting for option 3 that parents will make different choices that they perhaps will send to their local primary school or their local post-primary just because it's local and they won't have access to free transport. In Northern Ireland, I suppose we do value education and we want to send what we see, we want our children to go to the best school. And I suppose we will pay for that as well. Essentially, is the intention of option 3 to make parents pay for the choice?
No, that wasn't the intention. I think what came out very clearly from the evidence was that there is currently considerable inconsistency. Some choice is supported by free transport and some choice is not supported by free transport. And in particular, the fact that when you qualify for free transport to your nearest school in a particular category, that then gives you the opportunity to travel to a much more distant school within that category. And hence, option 1 was looking at just restricting transport to the nearest school within category. We had evidence that quite clearly suggested that any transport that was allowing bypassing local schools was in effect could be undermining that school, and that there was a call for the more simpler approach was just to support transport to the nearest school, and that was perceived as more equitable. What I would say is that we are not suggesting to say that parents should not have a choice of education. The question is whether or not the transport should be provided free of charge to any school. So it's not a question of choice of school so much as choice of whether the transport supports that.
But in a situation where you be a Catholic or Protestant, whatever way you want to look at this, and your nearest school, say if you're Catholic and your nearest school is a controlled school or indeed an integrated school or an Irish medium, but you want your child to be brought up in a school of your faith, you will not be supported by receiving free transport to that school.
Yeah, and I mean, we were trying to put forward a range of options here, illustrating how resources could be reallocated to address what was in our terms of reference in terms of supporting the broader educational objectives, and clearly supporting after-school provision and a level of equity for that for all pupils, and trying to reduce the walking distances were also priorities as well. So it was a question of redirection of resources.
And that would be fine, only you're still setting aside Irish medium and integrated, so you're creating a hierarchy of sectors, and I appreciate the statutory duty.
Well,
But
that
how
was
far- but
determined
how-
by
how
our
far
terms
does-
of reference rather than the panel's.
But how far does that actually go when actually then what you end up doing is removing that option from every other sector?
Yeah, in terms of Irish medium and integrated education, we were specifically asked within our terms of reference to reflect the current legal standing of those two sectors. So that is the reason that the recommendation is framed in the way it is.
But that creates a further gulf then between the sectors, obviously with that recommendation there. I mean, there's also, there's no hiding the fact that my party and others very much support the selective system, and in many respects, what this is doing is this is really going to have a major impact on the grammar skills.
Yeah, at the moment, a lot of pupils who qualify for free transport are attending grammar schools, yes.
I would imagine that if this is followed through, then to your recommendation, that this is where the opposition will certainly come from, and I'm assuming that we'll not be wanting in doing that either. But I mean, we do have to take into consideration the fact that, regardless of whether you like the idea of grammar school education or not, that it does allow for those from disadvantaged areas to have an opportunity to have access to
yeah, no, the
system.
report is not designed to be a commentary on a value as to whether or not it's pro or anti grammar schools. And one of the feelings that did come through in our evidence was we had some children who qualified to a school because they were in a grammar stream of a school, but lived equally. Others who weren't in the grammar stream didn't qualify for free transport, even though they lived that distance away. So you've got inequities even within same schools where you've got a grammar stream and non-selective streams.
And can you clarify why you didn't look to option 1 as your recommendation?
Option 1 was in effect a simplification of the current system. Option 3 would allow the maximum resources to be rediverted to address other points that had been raised through the evidence. So the recommendation 3 allowed resources to be sufficient to reduce the walking distance and address those safety concerns. It allowed enough to be redirected in terms of intraday transport and after-school transport. So that was the balance between option 1 and option 3.
Okay, and you're saying that this isn't really about saving money, because any money which is saved by looking at option...
That was very strongly why we made the link within the recommendation, that this was not seen as simply a cost-cutting exercise or recommendation. This was very much about meeting the terms of reference in addressing shortfalls elsewhere and redirecting it. What we would not want to see as a panel, I think, is just the first half of the recommendation implemented without the other elements being in place as well.
Okay, but rather than just simply looking at the criteria, did you look at other options of how money could be saved via the providers of the service?
Yeah, the costs of provision within Northern Ireland on a per pupil basis compare very, very favourably with elsewhere. I mean, you are paying about £700, £800 per pupil per year. That's very similar to costs in Ireland and to the rest of the UK. There are some areas of efficiency where costs could be saved. You've touched on the issue around administration costs. There are definitely areas in terms of enforcement of avoiding selling on of tickets, and we've made minor recommendations around those areas. The substantive monies that are going into home-to-school transport in Northern Ireland is due to the volume of transport, not to the efficiency of individual transport provision, by and large. So you've got limited scope for driving further savings through either cutting costs on board provision or on TransLink provision. It is the total number that's involved that is driving the costs.
Okay, and you didn't look at Scotland?
Scotland has a very similar system to England and Wales. It's distance-based. They have a provision to the nearest school, rather than to any choice of school. Walking distances vary in Scotland. It's typically a mile, mile and a half in some of the islands. During the winter, it's typically 2 and 3 miles elsewhere.
Okay.
It wasn't that we didn't look at it. I was familiar with what happened in Scotland. The reasons we looked at the jurisdictions we did were specifically related to the terms of reference.
Okay. Mr. Kinnan?
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. I congratulate you. An enormous challenge to try and pull it all together. It throws me into I mean, there are a whole lot of just different angles to it. And I suppose the first is I just don't see how you take it forward when so many other policies are moving at the same time. And if you take area planning, for example, and therefore we're pushing for changes in schools based on numbers and others, what's the knock-on effect from that? Then if we look at shared education that's coming in, that's going to change the whole of area planning, as well as the need in transport, then the entitlement framework, because that, and again, that depends on rural and urban. And my question is really, are we not doing this too early? I can see it's being driven by budget, and that we need to look at how we cut things and do it efficiently. But until all the other moving parts are moving less, not have stopped, are we not trying to do something that's almost impossible?
I suppose personally, I think you're probably always in a situation. Home to school transport is one of those very difficult areas that it spans transport and it spans education and invariably touches on a whole range of other areas. And the difficulty of finding a sort of period of time where you haven't got policy changes either affecting further education or special needs or looked after children or healthcare or whatever it is that affects is very, very difficult. I think you're actually in quite a good position with the proposals to change education and library board structures that give you an opportunity to align policies and align practices. I'm aware that there has been some work being done in terms of special needs that's looking at sort of Western education and library boards model to make schools much more fit for a wider range of needs so that it removes that need to go in and out of specialist provision in Belfast, for example. So I think there are also opportunities at the moment now in terms of the changes to organisational structures that actually fit with making some of these recommendations very, very timely.
Okay, so to look at a different way, because I can see we are there. If you then look on at the knock-on effects, if you start making the decisions in different directions, if you look at school numbers, as the schools, whether schools take more numbers, I mean, if I look in my patch of Antrim Grammar and Park Hall could take more.
Yeah, and we tried to look forward in terms of certainly the school population projections and where they were likely to be in overall categories of school. Looking forward, I mean, it's not a precise science. The best you can do is project forward. And I think one of the difficulties you've got with this area of policy is it's unlikely you would make changes retrospectively. So if a child was currently in a school, you would allow their current entitlement to continue through to the end of their placement. I think to do anything else would be very difficult. Parents make a selection on the basis of the current options that are available. Present time. So you always have a very long lead time anyway with any home to school transport policy changes.
If you, when you're doing the consultation, are you going to ask questions that would allow you to, for example, the traffic? For example, if everyone is being encouraged in the future to pay for their transport, you may get a whole mass more parents that decide they're going to drive rather than drive to a bus stop and pay for the bus. Is anyone looking in the get the questions answered that allow you to calculate?
We very deliberately did not make a recommendation about parent pay for all transport, partly because of the administrative costs around that and so on. I take your point that if transport isn't available, are parents more likely to use transport of their own than to pay for public transport? I think that there is clearly evidence from other areas that transition can be managed, but there need to be options in place.
But really to ask, if you're doing the consultation, will you ask whether they are likely to drive? Because then you'll get a guidance as to how many parents are going to end up all driving at peak hours. And certain areas of Northern Ireland can't take that much more.
Yeah, The difficulty I've got is that I am not responsible for the consultation going forward. That
Right,
clearly
okay.
is the Secretariat team that are sitting behind me in the gallery. But I would expect that any consultation would look at expected impact and also use experience from elsewhere in terms of managing that transition to minimise the shift to parents using car. I mean, one of the things we've made quite strong recommendations around is the need for a much more robust approach to sustainable travel and safer routes to school across Northern Ireland. I mean, in fairness, you are a long way behind other countries in terms of addressing car use for the school journey.
Okay, well, and my last point is not really then for you, but for those sitting behind you, was again the knock-on effect to sports clubs and all the other things that you do. If you start changing it, you end up having to change the viability of a whole lot of other things that people use buses for. But
Yeah.
anyway, as long as they've noted that, but thank you.
Mr Hazard?
Thanks very much, and thanks for apologies. I missed the start of your presentation. I just want to ask maybe perhaps around like best practice or European guidelines, for example, on how long a pupil should be travelling on a bus. I had the unfortunate situation I got 5 or 6 buses a day to school, which extended the day quite considerably. So I'm just wondering, is there best practice? Is there guidelines? What's sort of in the theory? What's the best way to look at this?
It's an interesting area. I mean, you notice we make a recommendation that there should be a maximum for overall journey time. And one of the jurisdictions we looked at is we met with colleagues at the Department for Education in Dublin, and there is an envelope within which they expect waiting time, walking time and the journey, so that they take all those elements in. The general practice in England is 45 minutes for a child of primary school age, an hour and 15 minutes for a child of secondary school age. That's deemed to be good practice. There is nothing in statute. And indeed, one of the early things in my professional career was being involved in a judicial review that tested that exact point.
Okay. And is that from leaving the home to arriving at school? Is that the whole lot, or is that
No,
bus
that's
travel?
just the bus travel.
Okay.
Yeah. And in Northern Ireland, you're quite unusual in that you allow, the legislation currently allows a child to walk up to 3 miles to the bus, whereas in England it is from reasonably near home to reasonably near school, which was why the recommendation was framed to mirror that in the policy in Ireland, where we were more impressed that it did take into account from home to from school, so that it actually took into account waiting time and the walking to the bus stop or walking from the bus to school as well.
Yeah, I suppose invariably it could be the waiting time stand at a wet bus stop or a cold wet. That is
Yeah, and all the transport research, when you value journey times, your time spent waiting and your time spent walking to the bus stop, you value very differently to the time that you're on the bus. Cause,
no problem. Well, I was going to ask about the Education Authority, but you actually covered that as well. Just finally, you mentioned there that we lag some way behind addressing car use in schools. Can you just expand perhaps on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I'm using England and Wales as an example, and we spoke to Transport for London. There are some extremely good proactive schemes in other countries looking at things like school travel plans, school travel ambassadors, more coherent policies in terms of looking at pedestrian and cycle routes to and from school. We've made recommendations around things like cycle parking, site planning for schools, in terms of uniform design that promote walking and cycling. So there are a whole lot of issues that I think there are lessons that could be learned from other places.
No problem. Thanks very much for that. Thanks.
Mr Newton?
Thank you, Chair, and welcome the opportunity to discuss the report. Can I ask maybe just a few short questions? I think they are. Maybe this isn't a fair question, but the new Education Authority, what would you, or have you taken any cognizance of the new Education Authority being formed and what impact that might have on the transport to school? Secondly, can I ask I'm not quite clear from the report what role that parents directly played in the report, and what is their reaction to option 3, if any? I'm looking at just the comparison across the education and library boards of the transport, and there's quite a wide variation in the cost on what accounts for that. And secondly, and finally, about maybe this is too difficult or too early, but the impact of shared education, those areas that are sort of declared, one would have imagined, looking forward, would have implications for school transport.
Okay. Can I take those in the order I asked them? In terms of the single authority, obviously at the time that we drafted the report, it wasn't clear exactly what was going to be happening regarding the structure of education and library boards. We were obviously aware of the work that had been done in terms of looking at the potential for a single education and skills authority some way back. We have made recommendations that there are potential for streamlining the administrative costs, and clearly if there was one single board that was overseeing school transport across the whole area, then there is a logic in terms of reducing administrative costs. We've also made recommendations of single points of contact for very vulnerable youngsters, and again, rather than having 5 individuals in 5 education and library boards, that would obviously be more logical with one. In terms of parents' reaction to option 3, parents were quite heavily involved in the initial stages of this review. We met with parents' organisations. Parents responded in terms of the calls for evidence as well. Because this has not yet formally gone out to consultation, it would be for the next stage for parents to respond to the particular options that are put before them. So whilst we have made our recommendations on the basis of the evidence from parents on the current system, they haven't yet had an opportunity to comment on how the options are structured.
Can I just ask on that, were all the contacts with parents via a parent-teachers association or
No.
some other
No.
individual parents as well as?
It was a mixture. We had representations made to us from parent teachers and umbrella parent organisations, if I can use that phrase. We also had individual parents who chose to give evidence to us, and we had responses from schools and we had responses from individual parents through the call for evidence. So it was a mixture of both, yeah. In terms of the variations in costs across the 5 education and library boards, the biggest difference is obviously the standout is Belfast. The reason for that is Belfast has a much higher proportion of children who qualify for free transport because of special needs. Far higher numbers in Belfast live within walking distance, therefore don't qualify for free home to school transport, and the children that Belfast board are transporting, a lot more of them have special needs, and that inevitably is more expensive. They generally have an escort on the vehicle, it's a smaller vehicle, and so on. That's where the big difference lies. In terms of shared education, those costs at the moment for transport are generally being met by the school out of different budgets, not out of the home to school education budget. And that was the point that we were making. Although the 73 million is the headline figure for home to school transport, in reality there are a lot more transport costs involved. Some of it is through entitlement framework funding, some of it is through shared education funding, so that there is transport costs associated with that, but that is into an individual school basis.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr McCausland?
Thank you, Chair. Am I right? You know, I apologise for being late. I was in a debate there. This is going out to consultation.
It'll
Right.
the
It will be for the
department.
department, and
They will be putting it out to consultation.
Well, the minister will consider this, and then he will put out his own recommendations out of this.
And then he
Consultation.
will consult on his recommendations, we understand.
If there's going to be a policy or legislative change.
I mean, some of these recommendations clearly will not involve any policy or legislative change. Others will require policy or legislative change. So, I mean, it has been presented to the minister.
Okay, that's fine. Just a couple of points then. You quoted a figure of £700 to £800 per pupil. I couldn't find the figure in there, but do you have a corresponding figure for Scotland?
Not dissimilar. It's about £700-800 for mainstream children.
So even though they have a system which is what you're talking about moving to, because, is that right?
It's not the cost per pupil in Northern Ireland.
number of pupils.
It's the number of pupils.
Secondly then, there's already a great deal of what I would describe as resentment within some schools when they see what they perceive to be preferential treatment for some particular sectors. Has any assessment been made of what the likely impact is going to be if one were to go down the road that is being proposed here, which would ring fences really, or gives preferential treatment to Irish medium and integrated schools?
I mean, in terms of Irish medium and integrated, I think, as you're aware, our terms of reference specifically asked us to reflect the current legal status of those two sectors. Behind this report, there was quite extensive modelling work done, and we were very fortunate to have the Strategic Investment Board did quite a lot of modelling for us in terms of where children were travelling and where they were going to and how many were going to their nearest school at the moment and how many were travelling much further. So that work has been done at a fairly high level, but I think it's fair to say considerably more would need to be done if it was moving beyond this into full impact assessment.
Thanks for your answer. I appreciate the fact this all goes back basically to the Belfast Agreement and to the embedding in that of preferential treatment for Irish medium education. But has there been any assessment, I'm just trying to tease this out, of what the reaction will be from schools that already feel disadvantaged? Because it's something that you pick up quite frequently. I hear it from boards of governors when you talk to them. But they feel they're losing children because, well, sure, I can get free transport to that other one, so it'll send me in that direction.
I have to say, having taken evidence from so many different schools and from so many different sectors, that I don't think there is a single one who doesn't feel that somewhere somebody is doing better than them. And a lot of the issues are cross-category. So whether children were in integrated schools or whether they were in Irish medium schools or whether they were in deep rural schools, many of the issues that they faced were consistent across those. You know, they had long journey times, or they had to wait and change buses, or they had no opportunity for after-school participation. It isn't necessarily that a particular issue is just applies only to one sector.
Okay.
Ms. Overend.
Thank you, Chair. It's just, we were talking earlier on how, just looking at different towns and different areas, different transport systems are in place. You know, one area will use all the yellow buses, and the other area will use all Translink buses, and supplemented by maybe private hire. Why didn't the report focus on the variation in transport costs in the different areas? You know, and define an efficient way within the current choices that there are? Would that have been something you would be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, the costs in terms of cost per pupil are not widely different between the boards, with the exception of the Belfast board for obvious reasons relating to special needs. And the costs are actually very similar between the TransLink provision and between the board provision. The decisions as to whether or not board vehicles are used or TransLink vehicles are used by the individual boards is largely determined on what the public transport network is, with the boards then used for areas where there isn't currently public transport provision. Okay. That's the sort of main factor. And the boards generally are using their vehicle fleet for primary rather than for post-primary. As I think having a closed contract and a regular driver and those sorts of vehicles are more suitable for the primary age group, whereas older children can obviously cope with using the network, public transport network, more readily.
Sorry, my children aren't eligible for a bus. So I don't have experience of yellow buses to primary school, nor did I get a bus to primary school. It was too close. I walked or cycled. But anyway, another question then, I was thinking, the report says that there's a link between transport accessibility and attendance. Is that right? By removing them school transport?
Yeah, no, it's very, very difficult. We have no categorical evidence that we could find that transport and attendance are fundamentally linked. So there was nothing from the education welfare officers that could be provided to us that said that they had a lack of transport was a factor in children being not attending school. What came out very strongly from the evidence was that if transport was removed or not available, then they may no longer be able to send their children to school. So there was a difference between current children who weren't able to, I'm expressing this badly, there were very few examples where children currently were being, or parents prosecuted for non-attendance to school and transport was cited as the factor. Other factors were much more important. However, parents quite strongly in the call for evidence were concerned that if charges were put in place or transport was removed, then they would struggle to continue to send their children. So that was a sort of slightly looking at it from the other side. What came out very, very clearly was that children with particularly additional needs, and I'm talking in terms of looked after children and the school-age mothers, the sort of more vulnerable children who are at risk of being excluded from school or no longer continuing education, for them, having free school transport that was much more tailored around them and supported them, often saw them through that sort of difficult patch or ensured consistency and gave them that continuity. And for them, there was a very clear link between providing transport and enabling them to stay in school.
Okay, thank you. And one last point separately. Do you think whenever this goes out to consultation and a review of school transport, there should also be a review then of road safety measures, crossing patrol at schools and that?
I think if we made quite clear recommendations that we certainly felt that more could be done around improving walking and cycling to school and sustainable travel, and that there were a number of recommendations around safety as well. The school crossing patrol is more interesting. Those are often being replaced by signalised crossings and so on. But the general point was we felt more could be done for certainly around road safety, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, and apologies for not being here from just on that about our most vulnerable children, our oldest children and so on. Have we looked at the long-term sort of education consequences of removing transport from them, from those type of children?
Can I turn it round the other way in that you've actually got a number of very successful initiatives in this area that have demonstrated success. There are a number of, certainly the school-age mothers scheme, transport has been provided for those in recent years, and that has shown significant improvement in participation and attainment and outcomes for those young women. Similarly, we had evidence from one of the AEPs, the alternative education providers, and one of the boards has recently changed and put in taxi transport around those young people, and they have seen a significant improvement in attainment and outcome for those youngsters. So we do know where transport works and is right and is put in, that it does actually have very positive results.
I agree wholeheartedly. And just in terms of was it ever suggest any stage of mean testing parents for eligibility for school transport?
Yeah, we were asked specifically to look at parental payment. The reason we have not recommended parental payment is experience from Ireland. There is a parental payment of €350 a year per family. There, about 50% are already exempt because they either have a medical card or special needs. The administrative costs of actually running that system are extremely high, and the €350 per family represents a very small proportion of what that transport costs anyway. So you have some quite high administrative costs. You then get into means testing it as well. Quite a lot of the evidence that came to us was that if means testing was linked to free school meals, there was the difficulty that parents were not consistently entitled to this. You know, benefit levels fluctuate, family incomes fluctuate, so trying to find a basis on which to mean test is also difficult. So for a number of reasons, we made a recommendation that transport remained free for those that were entitled.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. At this point, is there anything that you'd like to develop further with us around any of the issues that we haven't touched on at this stage?
I think two things actually that we haven't touched on as questions. One is in terms of public transport use for young people. Our terms of reference specifically asked us to consider free transport for all children, and I think the report's clear in terms of the number of reasons why we didn't recommend that. But what came out very strongly from young people was a very low awareness of what entitlements they have currently got to supported transport in Northern Ireland. So there was a very low awareness of things like Y-Link and concessionary fares entitlement, and I think far more could be done for encouraging young people to take up public transport already. And the other thing, finally, I would reiterate is the importance of young people's involvement in this area. At the moment, they don't have a forum to provide feedback in terms of either the quality or what they're provided with. And we've made a number of recommendations in terms of giving them an opportunity to be involved in providing feedback and shaping services. Because certainly the information and the views that they expressed to us were extremely articulate and very useful.
Okay, thank you. Mr McCausland?
Yeah, I was just asking, thank you, Chair. You say there was a low level of awareness. Was there any indication of whether that was more prevalent as an issue in rural, urban, or whatever?
Every single group we did with young people, there was a very low level awareness of what public transport there was already and what concessionary fares or offers were available to young people.
Okay, any other questions anyone would like to ask at this stage? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Safe journey home. Okay, members, there may be things we may want to return. We will be returning to this whenever the Minister obviously makes his comments on the piece of work. We may want to see if any further comment until then, or if there's any further clarification that you would like at this stage.
There's just one point there, Chair. You raised the issue around the new Education Authority at one point. What's the timeline for that? Or have we an update on where that is in terms of when do the boards evaporate?
1st of April is D-Day, but we're getting a briefing, I think, on the 18th of February? Yes, the 18th of February.
But if you walk into an Education Library board at the moment, they're operating on the basis, or So the
Business as usual.
business as usual.
Well, I suppose really they still have to, because
Yes, but if somebody says to you, well, in September we will be making a decision, you won't be, because you'll not be there anymore. Or in June we'll be making a decision, you'll not be there anymore. It's going to be something new.
Your question for the department, I think, on the 18th of February, they have a
18th
day one.
February, that's
they have
fine.
a day one plan, and ESAT, I understand, is now looking at the day one issues.
and
for
then the
Education Authority.
transitional processes,
And
and
the
after
change
that.
plan that the members mentioned before and back in September. So, Chair, in sum on the transport, it's I think the Chair had mentioned to me earlier just about the definition of minimum walking distance. I've looked up the 1986 order. It appears to specify the 2 miles and the 3 miles, but I would suggest, Chair, there might be an idea for the committee to write to the department and just ask, would legislation be required to actually do option 3? And also to seek some clarity in respect of the treatment of the different categories of schools. I have to confess, I'm not quite sure how controlled grammars are treated. Are they non-denominational grammars, or are they controlled schools? I suspect it's the first, but I don't actually know. And they also then put down a marker with the department that the committee would like a briefing on this subject when the consultation comes around.
Just around the costs, Chair, had you, Peter would remind me, what had you did around the cost of?
HEDU back in 2011 did a stage 1 report, and then there was a stage 2 report. You can find the report actually in your pack. So they looked at the different boards. They
I
found
see the figures here, but what were the actions?
there were, you can see it in my note, there were a number of recommendations. One of the things was for the Belfast board to explain why the per head cost, the per pupil cost was so much higher, why their taxi cost in Belfast and the North Eastern board at that time were much higher than the other boards. There were recommendations around gate to gate rather than door to door determinations of minimum walking distance. So there were a number, and one of those, that gate to gate, has reappeared in this report. So that one's been around for a couple of years. So there, you can see it actually, it's page 10 of my note. I've actually set out what the recommendations were for HEDU.
Right. Okay. Hear me.
Sean, Chair, she mentioned something in England, was it reasonable? Reasonably near the school from reasonably near the house?
Yes.
A bit more than what they
Yeah,
meant by
that's
reasonable.
yeah, because that's in, it has that in the report.
Does it define what
do
they,
the
what they mean by
comparators.
reasonable? Or does that go to a panel?
Right.
It is in the report.
Is it okay? I'd missed
That one up sort of, it's further info on that. There's also something in tabled items.
Yeah, there is, Jan. Okay. Content with those actions? Okay, if you just look at your table correspondence from the Minister, and it's just in relation to the tragic accident that took place in Clough-Mills. And the Minister is content to share the report with us, but there are a number of caveats attached to that, in the fact that it's a redacted report and should be kept within the committee. If you're content that we receive it on that basis, then that can be forwarded to us, but I think it has to be on the understanding that is how it's being received. Are members content?
Yeah.
Okay. Much. There's no other business at this stage. Can save that all until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the Senate chamber. Thank you very much. The committee's adjourned.
Chair, thanks members, thanks for coming, appreciate it.